Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to give my first impressions for 10.2's Season 3's Mythic Plus season and the dungeons that we are going to be experiencing. If you guys don't know, we have the Dawn of the Infinite, the mega dungeon that we've had for Dragonflight, and that's the only Dragonflight dungeon coming this season. Everbloom, a Warlords of Draenor dungeon. We have Throne of the Tides, another Cataclysm dungeon, Legion dungeons in Rook Hold and Darkheart Thicket, and finally some BFA dungeons in Atal'Dazar and Waycrest Manor. This is the least amount of Dragonflight dungeons that we have for the new season, so I wanted to talk about my impressions of them, what you can kind of expect going into it as we are getting to that point where we're almost done with like the tuning and like big dungeon adjustments, and we'll be waiting for like the countdown till 10.2 launches. First and foremost, the good that I like for a lot of these dungeons, in particular, I was super worried about like Throne of the Tides being very annoying, very frustrating. I think Vortex Pinnacle is pretty much like a letdown, but I will say that how much work that they put into like redesigning the bosses in particular has been really, really good for Throne of the Tides. In fact, they actually have quite a bit more challenge in terms of the mechanics than I would say some like Dragonflight dungeons do. In fact, the final boss, they sort of change it up for like purifying the final room of like Neptulon before you fight the giant squid, and it's really interesting having a lot of control over like how that fight's going to go, controlling some of the damage intake that the team is going to have, and it probably will have a couple nerfs coming into it because it's on the more challenging side, because if you let the sludge get out of hand, you can get really quickly overwhelmed. But I like a lot how they've changed that fight up, and the usual optional, the mind control boss, the squid boss in that instance as well. There's been a lot more effort being put into it, and even though it's kind of on the rails and there's not a lot of variety in terms of the percent, which was also a Vortex Pinnacle problem, I do think that dungeon is quite a lot of fun. And how they've revamped some dungeons like Everbloom as well, very much the same boat where they're changing up a lot of the boss mechanics to be able to sort of shake things up. Again, there's some things that are still very much overtuned, and they probably are going to be addressing those hopefully before the patch is going to drop, but I like how they've made a lot of boss fights very interesting. I think that was probably one of my big complaints with maybe like Shadowlands dungeons, is that most of the boss encounters that we fought in Shadowlands had like low heal checks and in some cases just like low mechanical checks. So it was kind of just fighting almost like Tree Mouth and like the Brackenhide Hollow, where it's just like, all right, well, you stand in one thing, you soak one thing, you take care of it, and then you just move on. So very big fan of that. And I would say in general, the new dungeons, or the old dungeons, I should say, that they're returning with, both Atal'Dazar and Waycrest, are tons of fun. And they've also actively been tuning so that you're not as dependent on like the old snap tech as we've dealt with previously. So if you didn't know about that, snap spots in Atal'Dazar and Waycrest were kind of where you would go to these no path available spots, stand on them, pull trash onto them as the tank, and have nobody else stand there. And then all those mobs would only be able to hit the tank, and they wouldn't be able to like charge out and, you know, slay ranged or jump on them and deal like splash damage or anything like that. So they've gotten rid of that. Doesn't work, or at least doesn't work in an efficient manner, but you can still have the DPS stand on those snap spots and then they can't get jumped on. At least at the moment, it doesn't really seem that necessary because they've significantly nerfed the amount of damage that the little Sara jumpers are doing. Although there still are like the elites in Atal'Dazar that'll still rush at you, and they deal quite a lot of damage at the moment. You can crowd control them. They feel like they're a little bit slower, or maybe we're just faster at the game these days to potentially dodge them. But in general, you're not going to be using as much snap tech, maybe like 1 or 2 pulls to be able to deal with some of those chargers. And otherwise, the dungeon is very much the same as what we're really used to. And so it's nice to be able to have that sort of return, and the usual sort of options in terms of what you want to pull has always been just in favor of Atal'Dazar, and also in dungeons like Waycrest, which has all of the doors open. And so another positive side effect is that you can really choose where you want to go. I don't know if they've changed up the witch spawns. They seemed really consistent, because that was another thing throughout the dungeon. These witches would just spawn in very set locations, and that would kind of adjust throughout the dungeon. I think they need to make sure that they're also tuning the right side. There's like these hunters, or like a hunting lounge area onto the right in Waycrest that a lot of people don't pull because it's so deadly. And so I'm hoping that at least throughout the season, they're going to shake things up to further encourage you to be able to pull different sides. Because that's just kind of one area that's like a weak spot for Waycrest, is that, yeah, you could have all the doors open, you can go wherever you want, but there's always going to be like a most optimal route if they don't make any sort of changes coming into it. When it comes to something like the Legion dungeons in Rook and Darkheart, This might be because I've just played for kind of a while, but going back to these dungeons, I kind of shrug my shoulders for this incoming season because I played them in Legion a ton, and then they brought back Legion M+ as well. And so for me, I'm a little on the lukewarm side for doing these dungeons again. In particular, Blackrook's a lot of fun, and they've done a decent job of tuning down some of the very unfriendly mechanics for melee. Used to be back in the day where you'd have to like sit back really far as ranged and kill off all the casters or all the hunter mobs because they would deal tremendous amounts of damage. You kind of couldn't bring melee at all. They've tuned them down a little bit, but they still hurt a ton. Darkheart, they've also... oh my gosh, Darkheart still has some of the nastiest mobs with like these giant bears all over the place. The poisoners are still quite a bit of a problem. And so I'm kind of tired of Darkheart just in general, but they also haven't made any big changes yet to some of the monsters, some of the cat jumps, the bears, some of the poisons that are available. I think right now that's my least favorite dungeon of the pool. But the Dawn of the Infinites are also kind of close, mainly because they're just not really tuned at all. This is something that has happened quite a few times throughout our like beta or PTR tests. They kind of like wait to the last minute to be able to change up some of the dungeons. And Dawn has a nice template, I will say, for what dungeons should be in lots of unavoidable damage. They just need to make sure they tune the dial from like 16 down to like a 7 or a 6 or something along those lines to set a nice base level of damage as it scales up. This is actually one of the things I always wanted for dungeons, is a lot of unavoidable damage, but less casts and less casters, less avoidable damage that people could stand in, where lower level keys, you're just healing people through cast going off, but higher level keys, you're just like praying people don't get one shot kind of thing. So that is a plus for Dawn. I will say, however, there is a very brutal amount of damage in most of the trash packs or bosses that we've seen. And so some of that just has to be tuned down a little bit. Actually, at the end of the day, I am really happy that they didn't start like kind of gutting all the mechanics of boss fights, because they said at the beginning that Dawn was on hard mode by default and that there was going to be some kind of changes as it went to Mythic. And there's like very slight changes, some that make sense, like they tuned down the gauntlet where you're getting sent back to the start, for example. I believe they've kind of tuned down some of the mobs that we're fighting, or some of the mechanics that we're fighting are a little bit slower, it feels like. Like we're not getting quite as many ads on like the Morchi fight, it feels like. Maybe I'm crazy. But in general, they didn't actually just like gut all the mechanics, which is nice, because a lot of the boss fights, like I said, with Dawn, feel like what M+ should be. Throne of the Tides, like I said, is the same way, where there's a number of like mechanics you actually have to pay attention to as a team, and you can't just like raffle stomp it into the ground and then just kind of like move on. So I am really excited about those. But I will say there's some negatives or some potential things you should really watch out for. Overall, these dungeons are a lot more mechanically challenging than I've seen from like Season 2 and most of the Season 1 Dragonflight dungeons. There's a lot the entire group is going to have to pay attention to, and I really expect there to be even more wipes to bosses on week 1 of the Mythic Plus season than most other weeks that we've had. There's obviously going to be a lot of learning because people haven't encountered these dungeons, but there's also going to be a crazy amount of interrupts required. Dawn, like I mentioned before, doesn't have too many kicks, which is good, but man, oh man, some of the places like Everbloom in particular, Darkheart, even Atal'Dazar, Waycrest have a lot of kicks going on. Some of them, like in the case of Waycrest Manor, the dinner bells that the stewards are casting are uninterruptible, and they force everybody to move, especially when you're in these narrow hallways and courtyards. It really restricts a lot of your space and makes it harder, of course, for your melee to be able to interrupt. I do think it very heavily favors melee like DPS meta and possibly even a melee healer meta, even though there are those like void zones that you have to deal with, because there's just so many kicks in over half of the dungeons. And it can change, obviously, we're still in PTR, but it still really feels like we need to have massive dial turned on like the cooldown between some of these casts. In particular, there's some, I want to say it's some of the caster mobs in Throne of the Tides, where they will spam cast a Chain Lightning, and then they'll also cast a heal and a hex. And so if you interrupt one of those three, they immediately start casting the other thing. And it's really, really horrifying to be contending with, right? So there's some of those like outliers that they really have to make sure that they focus on, and, you know, hopefully they will by the time that the content comes out. But I'm also excited and maybe a little bit scared to see how some of these bosses are absolutely going to annihilate certain people. At the end of Throne of the Tides, there's going to be the ink boss that you're fighting, where you're having to use the beams to be able to clear off some of the ink, kind of similar to what we saw out of the Junkyard boss in Mechagon. Kind of similar concept, but you also are having new ads coming out and killing those and making sure you're constantly clearing puddles, otherwise you're going to be taking a slew of damage. And they're coupled it with casters, AoE burst from the boss, and not the most easily seen void zones that you have out there. So it can get really, really nasty quite quick. Couple that with Everbloom. I like how they've changed a number of these boss fights, but some of them, they're gonna need some practice. The caster boss in Everbloom, they've changed up the mechanics, so instead of back in like Warlord's challenge modes, you'd be jumping in and out of like fire circles to dodge them. The boss just does AoE fire damage, or putting up frost orbs that are going to stun you and deal dot damage, or putting up an arcane orb, which when it impacts the furthest player's location, drags everybody to that spot. And she starts coupling combinations of those abilities 2 at a time. So sometimes you're dealing with fire and arcane, or frost and arcane, or something like that. And it's some unholy combination that you have to contend with, and it can get extremely, extremely brutal to try to survive. It also feels like they've kind of used the Assad fight as a bit of a template for Everbloom and Throne, as the squid boss and the final boss of Everbloom have a similar mechanic where just the boss spawns an ad and you need to be able to target swap. And I thought in Brackenhide and at the end of Vortex Pinnacle, we kind of saw how these like target swap, kill the totem, kill the mob before it kills you kind of mechanics are frustrating and quite annoying to be able to deal with. But it looks like we are going to be repeating that cycle and kind of going back to it. From the Dispel profile, there is a really large amount of poisons going out, and also a few diseases. For some reason, there's a disease in like Throne of the Tides dealing with water elementals, which stacks up the damage. So if you kill droplets, it increases the damage that the elementals themselves deal to you, which is pretty annoying. Darkheart, of course, is filled with poisons to the brim. I believe there's a number of hexes that you have to deal with in Throne of the Tides and in Atal'Dazar, as well as Dawn. If you actually step in some of the puddles, it turns out it's a curse effect that you have to watch out for. So something to watch out for on that one as well. But overall, bleeds once again. So I do think we're going to be seeing, Evoker of some kind in just about every single high key group. Dwarves are going to be in very high demand. And, if history repeats itself, I very much feel like the dungeon tuning and how the testing has been is very similar to what we saw out of Season 2, where you were able to kill all these mobs really quickly, but you were not able to always survive some of the damage if casts got off. Now, they haven't changed the scaling and they haven't adjusted the scaling for Season 3 yet, but they did the exact same thing in Season 2, where very early on in the season, it became a game of whether or not you would be able to survive the incoming damage. To the point that I remember, like, Tettles, for example, even made a video of, like, this is the best embellish if you're pushing M+, and it was Spore Cloak, because people just could not survive. So there definitely is going to be a really heavy emphasis on survival from just these boss mechanics and people getting used to them early on. But I am really worried about where they're scaling, like, the health and the damage of the base Mythic 0, which is going to affect everything as you scale into higher level Mythic keys. And I'm really worried it's again going to be DPS are able to kill everything easily, but it's a very large challenge to survive, because then again, favors the Augvoker, favors healers, tanks, DPS that can survive, and it starts constricting and limiting the meta and what you're actually able to bring. So we'll see, and I, like I said, hope I'm wrong on this one, but I think that's probably one of the most important things that Blizzard really needs to focus on to get themselves ready for Season 3 and hopefully make it as successful as possible. If you guys are enjoying this video and want any other information about the incoming dungeons, be sure to let me know in the description down below. Be sure to subscribe for more content and check out our Patreon if you want to support further. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.